O'Neill is the Associate Professor of the Department of the Environment of Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley. She is currently working on the global political economy of waste, including a book on waste as a global resource, but also as a risk. She teaches on global environmental politics and government. Here she is.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for having me here. It's fascinating to hear all of what you're saying and what you're doing. So I'm going to be talking about this story that is just so fascinating because it goes from like what our decisions are about what we put in the blue bin every week, right up to global geopolitics, the World Trade Organization, and that sort of level of global politics, which is kind of where I'm going to be today. I'm going to talk about the situation, the changing import and export situations about plastic in particular, and then China's motives and maybe some ways forward. No more foreign garbage. I'll get back to that phrase. It's important. China, national sword, and global scrap politics. National sword, I've also seen it translated as sharp sword at the gates of our country. And I was also talking to a Chinese-speaking student of mine yesterday who I think I don't know if she had the right phrase or not, but she said, well, it translates more to a very special sword that you have through your family, that you pass down through generations that you will never give away. So I have to check up on that because I thought that was a kind of fascinating way to think about, to reframe what China's motives are. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of what I'm going to talk about. I think we're all familiar with the July 2017 announcement now that that China was really going to start really harshly restricting the amount of certain kinds of scrap it's importing that affects particularly plastic and paper. And of course, as the previous speaker said, that came into effect in the beginning of this month. But people have been sort of prepping for those impacts considerably beforehand. So China, we know, huge importer of, this is plastic scrap, from other parts of the world. I'm sorry this is hard to see, but you see the United States, Germany, and Japan, the UK, all up there, Malaysia, that's a transit country, it's a bit of a different case, all up there, Republic of Korea. Indonesia is also a transit country, but all way up there in terms of the amount of plastics they ship to China, which again is really varies, but around about, for the plastic, over half of what we put, up to about half of what we put into recycling bins will be on a ship to China. We know the motivation for that is the fact that it's free shipping, more or less, that reverse haulage means the plastic goes back in the container ships that brought all the stuff to us from China. So it's become a very big piece, not just here, but also around the world, of what we do with our recyclables. And this shows U.S. exports of plastics to China from 2000 to 2016. And the blue line is the net weight, and the orange line is trade value. So you can see some variation there. And I think Monica might talk about some of the issues with the Comtrade data, but we're getting a sense from this at least about the trends. And I think one of the interesting trends is, where was it at 2000? Zero. And that's the year, or just in the late 1990s, China joined the World Trade Organization in 2000, which I think really loosened up some of the restrictions on scrap moving, as well as being the largest manufacturing sector in country in the world at that point. It's not just the US. This is the European Union, same time frame. Much as they are the world's greatest model for dealing with waste, in many ways, I will say, as someone who has lived in Europe, well, soon to be ex-Europe, for a part of my life, Europe's what they often say about what they're doing isn't always exactly what they're doing when you kind of peek under the carpet. I mean, I think, sorry, that's something that you find out when you start looking at waste trade politics, as I have over the years. But so the UK is a country that's particularly affected. My native country, Australia, in cities are already shutting down their collection programs, as far as I can see, in some parts of the country, as they are so dependent on the Chinese market. And Hong Kong, who is outside the green fence, is really having a lot of issues now with the plastic waste piling up, particularly as it was a transit point. It has been suffering since since the first green fence policy came in. And of course, you see those jumps there that represent the peak year of exports is really 2012. Then green fence came in 2013, which was kind of just holding back the tide. And well, Chinese imports continue to decline after that, but I imagine we'll see a very steep downturn here. So as everyone always asks, and I think we've talked a little bit about this, what happens to the plastic scrap in China? How many people have seen Plastic China? Plastic China is well worth looking up by Chinese director Wang Zhilang, excuse my pronunciation, and this was a documentary that got quite a lot of coverage on the film festival circuit here. And it very much clearly depicted families working in informal waste recycling. The informal plastic waste was very clearly labeled from this part of the world. It's definitely worth seeing because I think it brings this problem of how plastic is reprocessed and the impacts that it has in a country like China very clearly home. So the point is, and again, China transparency isn't great, that yes, some of it definitely was getting recycled. We know that, but under what conditions, we're not sure. And a lot of it too getting dumped and incinerated in different places. So this film also apparently was seen by members of the Politburo in Beijing, and it was what motivated them in some ways to actually implement this ban at the particular time that it did. At the same time, they yanked it off the internet in China. But anyway, so it's definitely worth seeing. So yeah, just quickly. So Beijing started to, as contaminated bales rose, as the amount of trash that the West was sending them rose, we got more careless about cleaning, sorting, and so on. And this is particularly, I think, at the household level. We started to see China starting to push back with Operation Green Fence, customs turning back a lot of bales if they weren't clean, didn't meet the right standards, too mixed, followed by Operation National Sword, which kind of kicked off in January 2017, but didn't get very stringent until, of course, July 2017. Again, we're familiar with the stricter contamination standards, which, although this is not a ban, it's very hard to meet. We've probably all heard ISRI's, the Institute for Scrap Recycling Industry's response to China's actions. So what are the implications? I'll just go through these quite quickly. Again, US, no, as far as I know, no large-scale or high-tech recycling plant. That's certainly enough to build the recycling. I know there's lots of people in this room who will correct me on this point. I'm working on data that was hard to gather for me. And the impacts are being felt very seriously, especially as on the West Coast here. We all know how waste is piling up at ports. They're piling up at ports in China. So there's a lot of impacts going on, and we really have outsourced with distance this very serious problem in ways that are now coming home to roost. China, now this is the interesting point. I don't know that, China, Beijing has, and this decision came from Beijing, absolutely not from the port authorities, the local businesses who are desperately opposed to this policy and were fundamental in undermining green fence after 2013. So Beijing is very concerned about the pollution crisis. It's also very concerned about its global image. Let's go back to that phrase, no more foreign garbage. China's starting to take on a role as one of the world's leaders, economic leaders, political leaders. And to do that, you really need to have a better image. And I think China, Beijing, felt very much that you could not be a world leader if you were seen as the world's dumping ground. Because, for obvious reasons. So, in fact, what's happening is that the imported scrap is being replaced by domestic. That was their plan, which is actually dirtier than what we send them. So it's really paradoxical when it comes to what the actual environmental impacts are going to be. So that is definitely up in the air. More plastics in the ocean and diversion to other markets. Here's Malaysia, plastic scrap imports. Particularly note what has happened during the era of Green Fence and National Sword. And there are a lot of other countries that are now vying for the trash that we once sent to China, the scrap we once sent to China. So given the flexibility of the global capitalist economy, this all happened very, very fast. And it just shows the flexibility of contracts and all of the great things that, that go with our global economy. So okay, so I think this illustrates China's changing role in the world. I want to say one of the things I think would be interesting from a global politics perspective is to see some disputes, some decisions happening at the level of the World Trade Organization. I know Israel's pushing for that. I think that this is a great opportunity for us to think about how do we differentiate between waste and scrap in global trade? How do we encourage trade in clean scrap that will be safely processed elsewhere? I happen to think that we do need to take care of our trash, we do need to take responsibility, but if we don't have anywhere where it's going to go, we need global markets for this scrap. And I think that it's going to be very hard figuring out how to get from A, where we are, to B, there. But I don't think we can even begin to talk about a circular economy unless we address what's going on at the global level. Okay, so I will stop there.
Thank you. Stay here with me. So who has questions, please? Don't see raised hands, because the last one was, we had several folks, but I think the three of you, because we're not yet done with this topic when we have Monica come up next, and I think that the three of you can offer a fairly comprehensive view on this. Okay, cool.
All right.
We're going to move on. Thank you very much for joining us.